the early development to do with ubiquitous computing was driven by this sort of liberal democratic ideal of we're all together, aren't we? And we're all sharing in the decision making in our corporation or our company. And our office should be more like a living room than a formal office where we're stacking racks and so on. And the devices that we've invented, in a way, accommodate that, and it comes through in our posture, so we can relax and put our feet up on the desk to some extent. And that, we get a sense that that's going to increase. And that's somewhat ideologically driven, as much as it's not just that these things are somehow utility to them, but also it does drive this sort of egalitarian emphasis in Bush, which is there in the manifestos of various companies like Apple and so on. There we go. So that was the first point, was about comportment, and there is, in a way, a political and ideological aspect to it. The second point is about everydayness, and again there is a political and philosophical angle to the everyday thesis, if you like. I'll just read bits of this. This is a quote from a French philosopher called Michel de Certeau, or sociologist, really. And you can see there at the bottom of his book, you can have this here, it's called The Practice of Everyday Life. There are many, many books written around 60s, 70s, and 80s. You use words like everyday. And again, it's sort of ideologically driven to some extent. It's about getting away from formalities of bureaucracy, of social control, of top-down government, or a big society, and so on. And it's about the everyday. And so this guy has a go, for example, at Le Corbusier, who is characterized as someone who, as an architect, is really about the top-down. It's about the genius architect making decisions on behalf of a housing estate, community, or whatever. And great as contemporary architecture or modern architecture is or was, it's kind of about hierarchy, about control and all said and done. So de Certeau was looking at housing estates and so on. And he argues here that many everyday practices, such as talking, reading, moving about, shopping, cooking, etc., are tactical. And so are, more generally, many ways of operating. And rather than sort of fight against the hierarchy and the order and the imposition of bureaucracy and big government, let's look at the tactics people deploy to exercise their rights as individuals against that control. So we've got the victories of the weak over the strong. Clever tricks, knowing how to get away with things. Hunters, cunning, maneuvers, polymorphic simulation, joyful discovery, poetic as well as more like. The Greeks called these ways of operating metas, but we go much further back to memorial intelligence displayed in tricks and imitations of plants and fishes from the depths of the ocean to the streets of modern cities. There is a continuity and permanence in these tactics. So what he's doing is celebrating the tactics of individuals and groups to subvert the hierarchy of the overall bureaucratic structure. And we do that through walking, according to this philosophy. And no doubt throughout the 4 years you're here, you'll be exposed further to some of these ideas. Walking is a big sort of thing. It sounds innocuous, but it's one way that we exercise our autonomy as individuals against the state. Because we can kind of walk anywhere. It's when people start to infringe our right to walk anywhere, we should look really on. As long as we can walk, as long as we can protest by walking, we're kind of exercising power. Well, how do these devices impinge on that sort of philosophy? Here's a quote from a guy called Vincent Raphael, who is one of many authors who've written about these phenomena where there's mass street protests and people gather together and empower themselves and protest whatever the movement is by virtue of having access to Twitter and Facebook and these devices, and you can actually mobilize your actions very immediately. And he talks here about the power of the crowd. It comes across in its capacity to overwhelm the physical constraints of urban planning, to blur social distinctions by provoking a sense of estrangement. And lots of people have talked about smart mobs in this paragraph. Reingold mentioned a lot of that. So smart mobs form and are abetted by whatever technologies are to hand, and of course what better than these technologies. So always has been this subversive appropriation of any sort of technology, and of course now mobile phones and other devices. there you go. So that's a role for these devices, and I think that's very important and interesting. And it's a changing role. If certain restrictions come into place, such that phone messages are being monitored, crowds will find some other way of mobilizing themselves. Right, that's the main thing. The third point is to do with places to think with. And again, there's a lot of philosophy and a lot of psychology, a lot of writing about the notion of environments as thinking environments. So we know, of course, as a library is a thinking environment, containing books as information there. With our laptops to hand, of course, there's information to hand. So to that extent, our environments are thinking environments. But there's also something else that's in a way far more architectural to contemplate, and that is, and it's particularly apparent if you think of sacred architecture. So you can see images there. It's Borough and Angkor Wat, and there's other sort of environments where the mandala as an architectural form is in prominence. And it's been said of such environments, you can say the same of cathedrals, that they are thinking spaces and they tell stories. That's one thing. Certainly in the reliefs and the sculpture and the stained glass windows or whatever, in those environments, they are environments to contemplate, to think, their communication environments, their storytelling environments. But also in the form and shape of those environments, there is thinking present. And my colleague Adrian Snodgrass, whom I wrote this book, Interpretation in Architecture, he talks a lot about the nature of these sacred environments and how they embody, again the body comes into play here, but they embody certain modes of thinking. Not least, you see it in the plans here, as soon as you move into realms of symmetry, you're projecting some notion of the human form there at the site of the sacred gnomon, in the center of the environment, and around that you have some orientation towards east, west, north, south. There's also a representation of the heavens through the idea of the circle, which is sort of in there as well. And anybody participating in this environment as a pilgrim or as a worshipper or just as a tourist even, is somehow participating in the thought of that place, which is about cosmology and about the heavens and about relationships between man and humankind and the earth and so on. So spaces are, particularly sacred spaces, special places that are being designed in this subconsciously, this in mind. They are thinking places. But then there is also an extension of some of these ideas to just everyday architecture, using this modular man there in one of these housing complexes. I mean, that's less perhaps about this, but there are notions of metaphor evident in the environment. And insofar as environments around us are the source of metaphors, then they are thinking spaces. So I'm sure if we, at the time, we were to sort of think through this environment here, no doubt the sorts of modes of creativity and thought would come into presence by virtue of the fact that, well, we can't see the castle, but the fact that the castle is occluded by a big monstrous building would no doubt invoke all sorts of thoughts. And of course, even the lighting itself, it's lighting, its screen arrangement, even power arrangement. So we can think through spaces, and we use spaces metaphorically very often to help us communicate with one another and to provide examples through which we think. Then there's a kind of another level, which is to do with situated cognition, which we won't have time to dwell on here, but one of the researchers in Professor at Edinburgh University is Andrew Clark, who's a philosopher in a way touches on cognitive science, and he talks about our whole environment as in fact a thinking environment, and he also writes about these devices in relation to that. I won't go into that in further detail. It's just worth noting that we think through our environments, and insofar as we think through our environments, these things are there as well. So how do they impact on this thinking character of the environment? We'll lose count now. I think I'm up to the fourth point of 6. Technological interventions that disrupt and reveal. We often think that what we're getting through these marvelous devices is greater contact, greater connectivity with each other, arguably a distancing from sociability of our environment as we really talk to our friends on this and ignore people around us. There are issues there. But I guess if we look at these devices in the most favourable light, we see them as contributing to a seamless engagement. Well, there is that whole sort of discourse about the seamless nature of these technologies and how they're getting friendlier and easier to use, and they enable seamless communication with each other. But there is a very real sense in which they're also incredibly disruptive. So I mentioned this sort of counter to sociability. But I guess one interesting point is that they bring to light issues that we wouldn't normally consider just by being present. So we think of sociability in new ways, our interaction with each other in new ways, in light of these devices. And you just have to sit on a train for a few hours to realise how disruptive these items can be. I mean, they create noise, they can be problematic in the environment and annoying. But even behind that, there is another sense in which they're disruptive, and that is to challenge what it is to be quiet, to challenge what it is to be in a sociable space, to challenge what it is to have a private life, because people speak out loud on these things and disclose aspects of their private life as they're talking to somebody and seem unashamed about that. Some people become even more private with these things. Anyway, a way of looking at such devices is to think of ourselves as becoming hybrid assemblages, which is a term that's used by this sociologist of tourism called John Urey, and he's written a book called Mobility, which is very interesting. He's not I really enjoy exploring literature, architectural literature, I have to say. There are lots of insights there, unself-consciously presented as architectural, but without saying this is an architectural insight. And so I commend reading outside architecture to one of the architectural fields. Anyway, he talks about tourism, and he talks about ourselves as hybrid assemblers. Initially, he's talking about us with trainers and handbags and backpacks and hats and ordinary cameras and so on. Later on, he talks about this concept in relation to mobile computing. So he was originally writing in the 1990s before mobile computing had a hold. Anyway, hybrid assemblies, that's what we are as tourists. Humans, objects, technologies, and scripts. We roam countryside and cities, remaking landscapes and townscapes through our movement. And I say, as a paraphrase of some of this stuff, for the tourists, such technologies include the car, the bicycle, hiking shoes, sailboat, snowmobile, and little it's personal stereos, camera, and